So after functional units and reference flows, we look at the system boundary. Essentially what this is something that determines which processes are included in the LCA in accordance with the goal that you just defined. So we take the example again of the 2020 EU study. Essentially, the dotted line that you could see is the scope or the boundary of this study. So this contains vehicle production, so everything that goes into the production of the vehicles in the first place, the vehicle use and operation, and also in conjunction with the fuel that is required to fuel the vehicles, and also the end-of-life treatment of the vehicle parts and recycling and everything that goes into these processes. For the Mashar project, our system boundary was defined by the theoretical manufacturing process. So essentially, we are not completely looking into the fine details about the manufacturing process and are keeping a very theoretical idea of it. We're also not having an exact recycling process in mind. We are still considering only theoretical end-of-life recycling processes. So this is very important to mention before you actually go into doing an LCA. An important thing to keep in mind while deciding on your system boundary is something called the cutoff criteria. In general, all processes and flows that are attributable to your analyzed systems are supposed to be included within your system boundaries. However, not all of these processes are quantitatively relevant. So for stuff that is less relevant, you could use data of lower quality, like estimates, and that would heavily limit the effort that's required for collecting high quality data. And essentially irrelevant information and irrelevant processes can be entirely cut off from your system boundary. We're not going to go into detail about system boundaries in this lecture, but we encourage you to look into this in the handbook that we have provided in the link below. Moving on, the scope of an LCA study also contains the LCIA methodology, also the types of impacts that are being analyzed. So in the 2020 EU study, you can see here a very large list of impact categories that were used to calculate the environmental impact. There were several impact categories being analyzed. So for example, climate change, energy consumption, acidification, and so on. And for each of them, there is a specific indicator and a unit. So an indicator is something that is used to measure the impact, and the unit is basically how much of this indicator you're measuring. So let's take the most common example for environmental impact, which is climate change. For this, the indicator is usually the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of global warming potentials. And this is computed using carbon dioxide equivalents, including carbon freebacks. After you have your LCIA methodology, you also talk about what limitations and data quality requirements your LCA is having. For example, with our Mashar project, we had certain limitations. So no data calculations on the performance of the substrate container itself were performed. So we have no answers in terms of the amount of mushrooms that are harvested specific to the containers, and also how often these mushrooms were contaminated. Furthermore, we also just use generic manufacturing and recycling data. So these are some very important things that you should clearly define in the beginning of your LCA.